Let's look at carboxylic acids. The functional group for carboxylic acids is a C double bond O with a single bond to an oxygen hydrogen group. The name carboxyl is the name that we give to this, and carboxyl is sort of a blend of carbonyl, which is the C double bond O part, and the hydroxyl, the OH. Put it together and we end up with carboxyl. The only group that has this is the carboxylic acids. The general formula is RC double bond O OH, and then we can remove that and put it into a condensed general formula, and we get RCOOH, or more simply RCO2H. That is the more common form of it. Some of the properties of carboxylic acids are that they are weak acids. That is the only property we're going to discuss right now. Carboxylic acids are all weak acids. How do we know they're not strong? Recall there are only 6 strong acids. These are the set of other acids. We will come back to the other properties later. Now we'll discuss how to name those carboxylic acids. As usual, we're going to find the functional group, helping us to classify it as a carboxylic acid. We'll see the COOH here, and that tells us that it is an oic acid. That is going to be the end of the name. Then we're going to put AN in front of that to indicate that everything else is carbon-carbon single bonds. If there were double bonds or triple bonds, we would put ene or ine, but in this class we will only have ane. Next, we're going to put in the number of carbons indicated by the main chain, and the main chain must be the longest continuous carbon chain that includes the carbon of the carboxyl group. Because the carboxyl group must be at the end of the chain, it will always be in position 1. So we will not give it a number, but we will use it to determine the direction of counting. Following that, we're going to add in our substituents and give those numbers. Those numbers will be based upon the direction of counting that we determined from the carboxyl group. And that's the basics of naming. Let's try some. Please note that you are not required to know these common names that are listed on the side. So let's go ahead and start naming this. First thing, find your functional group. We see 2 oxygens. I'm going to make an arrow that points to the carbon, telling us that that carbon is number 1. I like to do that to help you with the next group of compounds that we're going to name, which are the esters. By doing this habit of pointing to that carboxyl carbon, it'll help you to identify the main chain when we get to esters. Okay, so this is a carboxylic acid because it has a C double bond O, OH. That means the ending will be oic acid. And that is 2 words. There is actually a space between those words. Then in front of the oic, we're going to put in AN to indicate that all other bonds are single bonded. And then we're going to put in how many carbons we have. In this case, we have 1 carbon, so it is methanoic acid. That is it for the name. We do not have to add any numbers. There's only 1 carbon here, so it's obviously on number 1. But even if not, all the carboxylic acids do not get numbers. Let's look at compound B. Here we see we have a C double bond OOH. That is our functional group, telling us that we have an oic acid. In front of that, we'll put AN to indicate that it is all carbon-carbon single bonds. And in front of that, we're going to put in how many carbons are in the main chain. Make sure you include the carbon that is on the carboxyl group so that we count correctly. Here we see 2 carbons, and so this is ethanoic acid. Again, no number on here, so the name is done. Let's go on to compound C. Here's our carboxyl group. There's our carbon number 1. Now we look at this. There are 3 carbons. So the ending is oic acid, AN goes in front of that, 3 carbons, so prop, this is propanoic acid. Again, the name down below is not correct. It is a common name, it is not one that's commonly used. On to compound D. Here we see a carboxyl group at the end, so that's our oic acid. We see all single bonds, so AN in front of that. We see 4 carbons, so this is butanoic acid, and that is it for its name. Before we continue with more naming, I want to tell you some side stories about each of these. The first one, letter A, methanoic acid, also known as formic acid, is interesting because that is the acid that is used by red ants. When they inject a little bit of acid into you, it burns because they're actually injecting a little bit of formic acid into you. I thought that was interesting. Letter B is interesting because that is vinegar. Its common name is vinegar. We know it as ethanoic acid in this class, but it is commonly called vinegar or acetic acid. And acid C, propanoic acid, is found as a fermentation product of cheeses, and it's used to preserve a lot of different foods, but some people say it smells like body odor. And our last one, letter D, is actually what is found as a decomposition product when butter goes bad. So butter smells very good because of an ester, but when it gets old, it decomposes into butyric acid. This is one of the common scents that is found in vomit and body odor. Really hard to think of anything doing with butter having to do with vomit and body odor, but I thought it was interesting. Looking at letter E, it looks very similar to our butyric acid, but there's a minor difference. So we'll go ahead and try naming it. We'll see that we have a carboxyl group here on the end, so the ending will be oic acid. There's all single bonds, so it's an oic acid. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons in the chain. That makes it pentanoic acid. And then we have this branch off of it, which is a methyl group. So we're going to put that methyl in front. So we now have methyl pentanoic acid. And we just need to figure out what number to put in front of the methyl group. And in this case, it could either be, counting in the forward direction, it'll be on number 4, or in the reverse direction, it'll be number 2. So we're going to pick 4. And the reason we have to pick 4 is because the carboxyl group has determined the direction and it must be carbon 1. We can't change directions, so the methyl group must be 4. For the rest of the acids in this grouping, I won't be having you learn how to name them. They're just to make sure that you can identify where are the acids and to see some of the ones that we've been talking about in class. Letter F is oxalic acid. We've seen oxalate as C2O4 2 negative. We put 2 hydrogens on it, now becomes an oxalic acid, and we notice that there are 2 carboxyl groups on here. We go down to letter G, and we're going to see citric acid. Citric acid is the one that comes from fruit, citrus fruits, and so we'll see what it looks like. Hopefully you can notice that there are 3 carboxylic acids, and then one more functional group is present here, and that is a hydroxyl group or an alcohol. Because of the different number of carboxyl groups and different environments, the amount of oxygens present, we're going to see that these 2 substances have very different solubilities in water, and that they also have different pHs when they're dissolved in water. They are both weak acids, but it's hard to say which one's stronger and which one's weaker. You'll be testing that in lab. Can you find the 3 functional groups present in salicylic acid? First, you should be able to find the carboxylic acid. We should also see that there's a hydroxyl group, which causes it to be an alcohol. And the last one we see is the aromatic group known as a benzene. So those are 3 things that are present in salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is used as wart removers and acne cream, so you'll see it for those purposes. Just below that, in letter I, we have a drawing that is incorrect. I'm going to replace it with the correct drawing. This is now acetylsalicylic acid, also known as aspirin. Hopefully you can see its relationship to salicylic acid and understand what happens as acetylsalicylic acid decomposes. It turns into salicylic acid. So old aspirin is actually turning into wart remover. A little bit weird, right? And what functional groups do we see here? Well, you should see the carboxylic acid. It's still there. We still have the benzene ring, but what we've changed from an alcohol, we've changed it into an ester at this point. Okay, we can look at J. That is benzoic acid, one of the chemicals that we'll be using in lab to study. And it's got a benzene ring and a carboxylic acid, and is related to salicylic acid. It's a little bit different. And the last one in our list here, letter K, is lactic acid. It has a carboxylic acid and a hydroxyl group. So we see it's both an alcohol and an acid, and you may have heard of the term alpha hydroxy acid. Well, this is an example of an alpha hydroxy acid. The alpha means that it's next door to the carboxylic acid. So we have a hydroxy group next to a carboxylic acid. Additionally, this is an interesting acid because we find it in our body quite often, at least if you work out hard. When you work out, sometimes you don't get enough oxygen in your body, and instead of producing the CO2 that your body should produce, it stops part way and it produces lactic acid. This happens particularly in anaerobic exercise, so we don't get enough oxygen. Anaerobic means not enough oxygen, and so we'll see that our body produces more lactic acid. And oftentimes you'll feel something like what they call a burn. That burning feeling is actually lactic acid burning some of your muscles because the muscles are not getting enough oxygen. And so it starts to burn it. That damages the muscles, and yes, we rebuild our muscles once it's damaged, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is just an acid burning in your muscles. I think it's very interesting. Now let's draw a couple of carboxylic acids from a given name. Let's start with 3-ethyl 2-methyl hexanoic acid. So we see the oic acid that tells us that we're going to have a C double bond OH. We see the AN saying everything else is single bonded, and we're going to see the hex. Hex means 6. Let's start by drawing our 6-carbon chain. So we have our hexanoic acid. We're going to put in our COOH on one of the two ends. It doesn't matter which end you put it on, but whichever one it is, that will be position 1. Then we look at the rest of the name, and we'll see that on position 3 we put an ethyl group. Ethyl is 2 carbons long. On position 2 we're going to put a methyl group that's 1 carbon long, and then we have our carbon skeleton. After that we just need to add our hydrogens in, making sure that every carbon has 4 bonds and every oxygen has only 2. And there's our structure, 3-ethyl 2-methyl hexanoic acid. Let's try a really tough one. Letter B is 3,3,4,4 tetrachloro 6-isopropyl 2-pentyldecanoic acid. This is far harder than anything you would have to do on the test, but I wanted to give you an idea that you could get through something like this. Where do we start? We start at the back side. So we see it's a decanoic acid. The oic acid tells us carboxyl group. The AN says everything else is single bonded, and the dec tells us that there are 10 carbons in the main chain. Let's draw those first. Now we're going to put in all the other groups that we see here. So I'm going to go in order because I like to not forget which ones I'm doing. So on carbon 3, I'm going to put a chlorine. On 3 again, I'm going to put another chlorine. On 4, I'm going to put another chlorine. On 4, I'm going to put another chlorine group. Then we go to carbon number 6. We're going to put an isopropyl. Remember, propyl means 3 carbons. Iso means that it is attached to the middle of those 3 carbons. So a bond should go from carbon 6 to the middle of the 3 carbons in the isopropyl group. Next we go to carbon 2, and we're going to put in 5-carbon chain. That is pentyl group. So we now have our carbon skeleton. The next step is to add our hydrogens in, and we're going to make sure that every carbon has 4 bonds to it, and that the oxygens each have 2. The hydrogens and the halogens should each have 1. And there's our structure, 3,3,4,4 tetrachloro 6-isopropyl 2-pentyldecanoic acid. Can you believe you can draw something like that? I also chose this one for a specific reason. So you'll notice that we have a decanoic acid, but could I have had a longer chain? Yes, I could have. Notice that we have a pentyl group hanging off of carbon 2. That means there would be 5 carbons coming off instead of just this one. That means it would be a 14-carbon compound. But instead, we chose to have a 10-carbon main chain, and that is because it must include the carbonyl carbon. And the longest chain that includes that carbonyl carbon is 10, and so we get a decanoic acid.